The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds as Marcus stood before his bathroom mirror, not merely preparing for another day, but orchestrating his transformation from the man he was yesterday into the strategically superior version he would become today. This was not vanity, this was warfare. The first battlefield of every successful person is the mind, and, like any skilled general, Marcus understood that victory was won not in the heat of battle, but in the methodical preparation that preceded it. For 3 years, Marcus had been applying what he privately called the Machiavellian morning protocol, 10 deliberate practices that forged mental resilience, strategic thinking, and psychological dominance. These weren't mere self-help mantras or feel-good affirmations. They were hardened principles extracted from centuries of political philosophy, military strategy, and psychological warfare, refined into a daily practice that transformed ordinary individuals into forces of nature. The genesis of these rules came not from books alone, but from Marcus's own brutal education in corporate politics, failed relationships, and personal defeats that had nearly broken him. At 32, he had found himself stripped of his executive position, divorced, and questioning everything he thought he knew about power, influence, and success. It was in this darkness that he discovered the works of Niccolò Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, and Robert Greene not as historical curiosities, but as practical guides for rebuilding himself into someone unbreakable. The transformation had been remarkable. Within 2 years of implementing these morning practices, Marcus had not only regained his professional standing but had transcended it. He now ran his own consulting firm, commanded respect in every room he entered, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's motivations and manipulate outcomes to his advantage. More importantly, he had become psychologically invulnerable, no longer at the mercy of other people's opinions, manipulations, or attempts to undermine him. Part 1: The Foundation of Morning Dominance. The alarm pierced the silence at 4:47 a.m., not 5 a.m., not 4:45 a.m., but 4:47 a.m. The precise timing was intentional, a small but significant assertion of control over his environment. While the world slept, Marcus would begin his daily conquest of weakness, mediocrity, and the 1,000 small compromises that reduced most people to shadows of their potential. Rule 1: Embrace the silence before the storm. In those first moments of consciousness, before the mind could flood with anxieties, obligations, and the reactive patterns that govern weaker men, Marcus practiced what Machiavelli might have called the cultivation of inner stillness. But this was not meditation in any spiritual sense, it was strategic reconnaissance of his own mental state. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Marcus conducted a rapid but thorough assessment of his psychological resources. What emotions were attempting to influence him? What fears were lurking in the shadows of his consciousness? What desires might cloud his judgment today? This wasn't navel-gazing, it was intelligence gathering. A general who doesn't understand his own army's condition is destined for defeat. The weak allow their emotions to dictate their actions. They wake up reactive, immediately checking their phones, allowing the digital chaos of others to set their mental tone for the day. They surrender their psychological sovereignty before they've even stood up. Marcus had learned that the first victory of every day was the victory over his own potential weakness, the lazy impulse to remain comfortable, the fearful voice that whispered about potential failures, the angry remnants of yesterday's frustrations. In these precious minutes of silence, he didn't fight these emotions or pretend they didn't exist. Instead, he acknowledged them with the cold assessment of a strategist evaluating enemy positions. Fear of the upcoming board presentation? Noted and cataloged useful information about stakes and preparation required. Anger at his business partner's latest passive-aggressive email? Interesting data about relationship dynamics that needed addressing. The key was never to be controlled by these emotional states, but to use them as intelligence about his environment and his own psychological landscape. This practice had taught Marcus something profound about human nature. Most people were slaves to their emotional reactions because they never took the time to consciously observe them. They lived in a constant state of psychological reactivity, bouncing from one feeling to another like pinballs. But the person who could observe his own mental state with detachment possessed a tremendous advantage. He could choose his responses rather than being controlled by them. Rule 2: Destroy yesterday's version of yourself. As Marcus moved to his home gym, he carried with him a mental exercise that had become central to his transformation: the deliberate destruction of yesterday's limitations. Machiavelli wrote that since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Marcus applied this principle internally. It was far safer to fear his own mediocrity than to love his comfort zones. While his body moved through the precise choreography of his workout routine, his mind engaged in what he termed aggressive self-improvement. This wasn't positive thinking or gentle self-encouragement. It was the systematic identification and elimination of weakness. Every day, Marcus forced himself to confront one specific way he had been mediocre, cowardly, or strategically foolish in the previous 24 hours. Yesterday, he had allowed a junior employee to interrupt him 3 times during a strategy meeting. The old Marcus might have told himself this showed he was approachable and democratic. The new Marcus recognized it as a failure of presence and authority. He had failed to establish proper hierarchical boundaries, and, in doing so, had diminished his own power while enabling disrespectful behavior. Today, this weakness would be consciously corrected. The physical exercise served as both metaphor and catalyst for this mental work. As he pushed his body beyond its comfort zone, he simultaneously pushed his psyche beyond its habitual limitations. Each repetition was not just building muscle, it was building the neural pathways of dominance over his own resistance. The man who could force his body to perform when it wanted to quit was developing the psychological infrastructure to force his mind to think strategically when it wanted to react emotionally. This practice had revealed to Marcus one of the most important truths about human psychology: we are not fixed entities. The person he was yesterday, with all of yesterday's fears, limitations, and small compromises, was not the person he had to be today. But this transformation required violence against his own mediocrity. It required him to be ruthless with his own excuses, comfortable with his own discomfort, and willing to abandon the familiar patterns that kept him small. Most people clung to their identity like a security blanket, afraid that changing too much would somehow negate who they really were. Marcus had discovered the opposite. His truest self was not the collection of his past behaviors and limitations, but the unlimited potential that emerged when he refused to be constrained by his history. Rule 3. Study your enemies while they sleep. As dawn broke over the city, Marcus sat at his computer engaging in what he privately called morning intelligence gathering. While his competitors slept, while his business rivals remained unconscious, he was studying them with the systematic attention of a military strategist preparing for war. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical wisdom. Machiavelli understood that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. The corollary was equally true: if Marcus could understand what others really were beneath their public facades, he would possess enormous strategic advantages. Social media profiles, LinkedIn updates, company press releases, industry gossip, Marcus absorbed it all with the analytical mind of an intelligence operative. But he wasn't looking for surface information. He was looking for patterns of weakness, vulnerability, and predictable behavior. When his main competitor posted about working late, Marcus saw not dedication but poor time management and possible personal problems. When a potential client complained online about their current service provider, Marcus saw an opening for strategic relationship building. The weak scrolled through social media passively, allowing it to trigger their insecurities and jealousies. The strong used it as a surveillance tool, gathering actionable intelligence about the psychological states, priorities, and vulnerabilities of everyone in their professional and personal ecosystem. But Marcus's morning intelligence gathering went deeper than digital reconnaissance. He maintained detailed psychological profiles of every significant person in his life, their motivations, fears, triggers, and predictable responses to different types of pressure or persuasion. This wasn't manipulation in any crude sense, it was strategic empathy. He understood people better than they understood themselves, which allowed him to predict their behavior and position himself advantageously in every interaction. This practice had taught him that most people were remarkably predictable once you understood their core psychological drivers. The ambitious young executive who talked constantly about innovation was actually terrified of being seen as irrelevant. The successful entrepreneur who boasted about his work-life balance was desperately seeking validation for choosing family over maximum financial success. The confident sales director who dominated every meeting was overcompensating for deep-seated imposter syndrome. Armed with these insights, Marcus could navigate every human interaction with surgical precision. he knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to motivate, intimidate, or inspire anyone in his orbit. More importantly, he knew which of his own psychological buttons others might try to push, and how to render himself immune to their attempts. Part 2, The Architecture of Psychological Dominance. As the city awakened around him, Marcus transitioned from intelligence gathering to strategic planning, but not the kind of planning most people engaged in. While others made to-do lists and scheduled meetings, Marcus was architecting psychological dominance, designing not just what he would do today, but who he would be and how others would experience his presence. Rule 4, Never reveal your true strength until the moment of strike. Marcus poured his morning coffee with the same deliberate precision he brought to every action, understanding that power was not about what others knew you could do, but about what they didn't know you were capable of. Machiavelli's prince was most effective when his enemies underestimated his capabilities, and Marcus had learned to apply this principle in every aspect of his professional and personal life. In the corporate world, Marcus had mastered the art of strategic understatement. When colleagues asked about his weekend activities, they heard about peaceful hiking trips, not the advanced negotiation seminars he attended. When discussions turned to industry trends, he offered thoughtful questions rather than displaying his comprehensive knowledge. He had learned to position himself as thoughtfully curious rather than obviously expert, allowing others to underestimate his preparation and strategic thinking. This approach required tremendous psychological discipline. The ego naturally wanted to display its knowledge, to be recognized and validated for its expertise. But Marcus had trained himself to derive satisfaction not from being obviously impressive, but from being quietly superior. He took pleasure in watching competitors reveal their strategies while keeping his own cards close to his chest. The previous month, during a critical client presentation, Marcus had watched his main competitor deliver an elaborate PowerPoint filled with industry jargon and complex frameworks. The client seemed moderately impressed but not excited. When Marcus's turn came, he had set aside his prepared presentation and instead asked 3 simple but penetrating questions that revealed he understood the client's real problem better than they did themselves. The questions seemed casual, almost improvised, but they were the result of weeks of strategic preparation that no one else in the room suspected. This principle extended beyond professional contexts into personal relationships. Marcus had learned that people felt more comfortable around others who seemed slightly less capable than themselves. By managing the impression of his own competence, he could put others at ease while positioning himself to observe their unguarded behavior. People told him their real thoughts, revealed their actual motivations, and exposed their genuine weaknesses because they didn't perceive him as a threat. The psychological sophistication required for this approach was considerable. Marcus had to maintain clear internal awareness of his actual capabilities while carefully managing external perceptions. He had to resist the ego's desire for immediate recognition while building toward longer-term strategic advantages. Most importantly, he had to develop the patience to allow others to underestimate him until the precise moment when revealing his true strength would maximum impact. Rule 5, Make others dependent on your judgment. As Marcus reviewed his calendar for the day, he practiced what he considered one of his most sophisticated psychological strategies, making himself indispensable not through his actions, but through his judgment. Anyone could work hard, but few people could think clearly under pressure, and even fewer could help others think clearly when their emotions were clouding their reasoning. This principle had emerged from Marcus's observation that power ultimately derived not from being needed for what you could do, but from being needed for how you could think. Physical tasks could be automated or delegated to cheaper resources. But wisdom, strategic insight, and the ability to see clearly through complex situations, these were irreplaceable human capabilities that created genuine dependency. In every meeting, Marcus positioned himself as the person who could cut through confusion and identify the real issues at stake. When colleagues presented problems, he didn't immediately offer solutions. Instead, he asked questions that helped them understand their problems more clearly. When teams faced difficult decisions, he didn't argue for his preferred option. Instead, he helped everyone understand the full range of consequences associated with each choice. This approach required him to suppress his natural instinct to be right and, instead, focus on being useful. It meant sometimes guiding people toward conclusions he had reached hours or days earlier, allowing them to feel ownership of insights he had actually generated. The psychological sophistication required was immense. He had to be simultaneously ahead of everyone else's thinking while allowing them to feel intelligent and autonomous. The results were remarkable. People began seeking his input not just on professional matters but on personal decisions. They valued his perspective because he had trained himself to see situations from multiple angles simultaneously. While others got caught up in their emotional reactions to problems, Marcus could maintain the psychological distance necessary to identify optimal strategies. Last week, his business partner had come to him in crisis over a major client threatening to leave. While his partner cycled through anger, self-doubt, and panic, Marcus had calmly helped him see that the client's threats were actually a negotiation tactic triggered by pressure from their own board. Instead of responding defensively, they had positioned themselves as solutions to the client's board-level political problems, ultimately strengthening the relationship while increasing their fees. This incident illustrated the core psychological principle: most people's thinking became muddled when their emotions were activated. The person who could maintain clear reasoning while others were emotionally reactive possessed enormous influence. People naturally deferred to the judgment of whoever seemed most psychologically stable and strategically clear. Rule 6: Control the narrative, control the reality. Marcus's morning routine included what he privately called narrative architecture, the deliberate construction of the story he wanted others to tell about him, his company, and his role in various situations. He had learned that reality was far less objective than most people believed. It was largely constructed through the stories people told themselves and each other about what was happening. Machiavelli understood that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Marcus applied this insight by recognizing that how people perceived events was often more important than what had actually occurred. The person who could influence perception could effectively influence reality. This wasn't about lying or creating false information. It was about understanding that every situation could be framed in multiple ways, and that the framing that became dominant would shape how everyone involved understood what had happened and what it meant. The person who took responsibility for constructing the narrative possessed tremendous power over how events were interpreted and remembered. When Marcus's consulting firm had lost a major client 6 months earlier, he could have allowed the natural narrative to take hold. They had been fired for poor performance, they had failed to meet expectations, they were not as competent as they had claimed. Instead, Marcus had carefully constructed a different story. They had identified fundamental strategic misalignments with the client's long-term vision. They had chosen to prioritize their integrity over short-term revenue. They were focused on working only with clients whose values matched their own high standards. The psychological brilliance of this approach was that both narratives contained elements of truth. The difference was that Marcus's version positioned his firm as principled and selective rather than inadequate and rejected. Within weeks, this narrative had become the accepted understanding of what had happened, not just within his company but within their broader professional network. Marcus spent time each morning considering the key situations in his life and deliberately crafting the frames through which he wanted others to understand them. When he made a strategic mistake, he framed it as a valuable learning experience that had provided crucial insights. When he succeeded, he framed it as the predictable result of systematic preparation rather than luck. When others achieved something he wanted, he framed it as confirmation that his own strategic approach was sound. This practice required psychological sophistication because it meant taking responsibility for managing not just his actions, but their meaning. It meant understanding that objective facts mattered far less than the interpretive framework people used to understand those facts. Most importantly, it meant recognizing that if he didn't take conscious control of the narrative, someone else would, and their version might not serve his interests. Part 3: The weaponization of daily discipline. As the morning sun reached its full strength, Marcus entered the final phase of his daily transformation ritual. The intelligence had been gathered, the psychological foundation had been established, and the strategic narrative had been constructed. Now came the most crucial element: the weaponization of these mental resources through practices that would make him psychologically invulnerable throughout the day. Rule 7: Anticipate betrayal before it arrives. Marcus's final cup of coffee was accompanied by what he considered his most psychologically sophisticated practice: the systematic anticipation of potential betrayals, disappointments, and strategic reversals. This wasn't paranoia or negative thinking, it was strategic immunization against the psychological devastation that destroyed most people when their trust was violated or their expectations were shattered. Machiavelli wrote that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done, sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. Marcus had learned to apply this principle by never allowing himself to become emotionally dependent on other people's loyalty, consistency, or good intentions. Instead, he mentally prepared for the possibility that anyone in his life might act in ways that disappointed or harmed him. This morning, Marcus systematically considered each significant relationship in his professional and personal life, imagining how each person might betray his trust or fail to meet his expectations. His business partner might decide to start a competing firm and steal their best clients. His most trusted employee might be sharing confidential information with competitors. His romantic partner might be maintaining emotional connections with her ex-boyfriend. The psychological sophistication of this exercise lay not in becoming cynical or suspicious, but in achieving emotional invulnerability through preparation. By imagining these possibilities in advance, Marcus could enjoy the benefits of trust and connection without the psychological devastation that typically accompanied betrayal. He could invest in relationships fully while maintaining the strategic flexibility to respond effectively if those relationships evolved in unexpected directions. 3 months earlier, this practice had proven its value when Marcus discovered that his head of sales had been negotiating secretly with their largest competitor about bringing several major clients with him. While other executives might have experienced this as a devastating personal betrayal, Marcus had already considered this possibility and prepared multiple response strategies. Instead of reacting emotionally, he had calmly implemented a plan that not only retained their key clients but ultimately strengthened his company's competitive position. The deeper psychological principle was that most people's emotional stability depended on their expectations being met by external circumstances they couldn't control. When reality failed to conform to their hopes and assumptions, they experienced psychological crisis. But the person who had anticipated multiple possible outcomes could respond to any development with strategic calm rather than emotional chaos. This didn't mean becoming cold or disconnected from others. Marcus maintained warm, trusting relationships while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that those relationships might change. He enjoyed success while preparing for potential failure. He appreciated loyalty while anticipating potential betrayal. This psychological flexibility made him simultaneously more resilient and more effective in every aspect of his life. Rule 8: Transform every obstacle into strategic advantage. As Marcus prepared for his day, he engaged in a mental exercise that had become central to his psychological dominance: the systematic reframing of every potential problem as a strategic opportunity. This wasn't positive thinking or self-delusion, it was the disciplined application of strategic creativity to transform difficulties into advantages. The principle derived from Marcus's understanding that psychological resilience came not from avoiding problems but from developing superior problem-solving capabilities. The person who could consistently find opportunities within obstacles possessed enormous advantages over those who were simply trying to minimize difficulties. Marcus's calendar showed 3 potentially problematic situations today: a difficult conversation with an underperforming team member, a client meeting where he would need to explain cost overruns, and a dinner with his ex-wife to discuss custody arrangements. Most people would approach these situations with anxiety, trying to minimize damage and hoping for the best outcomes. Marcus approached them as strategic opportunities. The underperforming employee conversation was a chance to demonstrate leadership while potentially identifying systemic issues in his training processes. The client meeting was an opportunity to strengthen the relationship by showing how well he managed unexpected challenges while positioning his firm for additional services. The dinner with his ex-wife was a chance to practice his most advanced interpersonal skills while modeling the kind of mature, strategic thinking that would benefit their children. This reframing required tremendous psychological discipline. It meant suppressing the natural human tendency to avoid discomfort and instead embracing difficult situations as training grounds for developing superior capabilities. It meant viewing every person who opposed him as a sparring partner who was making him stronger rather than an enemy who was trying to harm him. The previous year, when a major client had demanded a 50% reduction in fees while expanding the scope of work, Marcus's competitors had either walked away from the project or accepted the terms while complaining about unreasonable clients. Marcus had used the situation to demonstrate his problem-solving abilities by proposing an innovative fee structure based on measurable results rather than billable hours. The approach not only satisfied the client but became a competitive advantage that helped him win 3 additional clients who preferred his results-based model. This incident illustrated the core psychological principle: obstacles only remained obstacles as long as you approached them with conventional thinking. The person who could generate creative responses to difficult situations could transform any challenge into a competitive advantage. More importantly, the consistent practice of reframing problems as opportunities trained the mind to approach all difficulties with confidence rather than anxiety. Rule 9. Create multiple versions of victory. Marcus's morning routine concluded with what he considered his most strategically sophisticated practice: the creation of multiple definitions of victory for every significant situation he would encounter. This principle emerged from his understanding that psychological resilience required flexibility in how success was measured and achieved. Most people approached important situations with rigid definitions of what constituted winning or losing. If they achieved their specific desired outcome, they felt successful. If they didn't, they felt defeated. This binary thinking made them psychologically vulnerable because it gave them only one pathway to satisfaction and confidence. Marcus had learned to identify multiple ways that any situation could serve his long-term interests. If he won a contract, that was obviously good for business. If he lost the contract but impressed the client with his strategic thinking, that could lead to future opportunities or valuable referrals. If he lost the contract and learned important lessons about his presentation or pricing, that intelligence could help him win future competitions. If the loss revealed that he didn't want to work with that type of client, he had gained valuable strategic clarity. This approach required psychological sophistication because it meant maintaining awareness of multiple success metrics simultaneously. It meant being genuinely committed to achieving his primary objectives while recognizing that secondary and tertiary benefits might ultimately prove more valuable than his original goals. Last month, Marcus had invested significant time preparing for what seemed like a perfect client engagement: prestigious company, excellent fee structure, interesting strategic challenges. When he learned that they had hired a competitor instead, his initial reaction was disappointment. But, within hours, he had identified multiple ways the situation had actually served his interests. He had refined his presentation approach based on their feedback, he had established relationships with 3 key executives who might hire him for future projects, and he had discovered that his competitor's approach was different enough that they weren't really competing for the same type of work. More importantly, the client who did hire his competitor called him 2 weeks later with a different project that proved more interesting and lucrative than the original opportunity. If Marcus had won the first contract, he wouldn't have been available for the second one. This experience reinforced his understanding that apparent setbacks often created conditions for superior outcomes, but only if he remained psychologically flexible enough to recognize and capitalize on unexpected opportunities. The person who could find victory within apparent defeat possessed enormous advantages over those who could only succeed through direct achievement of their original objectives. Rule 10. End each day stronger than you began. The final element of Marcus's morning routine was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated: the pre-commitment to ending each day psychologically stronger than he had begun it. This wasn't about achieving specific external goals or accumulating particular accomplishments. It was about ensuring that every day contributed to the systematic development of his mental and strategic capabilities. Marcus understood that most people experienced their days as things that happened to them rather than opportunities they actively crafted for their own development. They reacted to events, responded to other people's agendas, and hoped that external circumstances would align with their desires. This passive approach meant that they often ended their days feeling depleted, frustrated, or defeated by forces beyond their control. Marcus approached each day as a carefully designed training program for developing superior psychological and strategic capabilities. Every interaction was an opportunity to practice influence. Every challenge was a chance to develop problem-solving skills. Every setback was material for building resilience. Every success was data about which approaches worked most effectively. This perspective meant that Marcus literally couldn't have a bad day in any conventional sense. Even days filled with disappointments, conflicts, and failures served his long-term development if he extracted the right lessons and applied them to strengthen his future performance. The person who could learn faster than his competitors could outmaneuver them even when starting from disadvantageous positions. But this approach required tremendous psychological discipline. It meant maintaining awareness of his own development even in the midst of stressful situations. It meant asking himself throughout each day what capabilities he was building and what insights he was gaining. It meant ending each day with systematic reflection on what had worked, what hadn't, and what adjustments he would make going forward. The cumulative effect of this practice had been remarkable. Over the course of 3 years, Marcus had transformed not just his external circumstances but his fundamental relationship with difficulty, uncertainty, and challenge. Where he had once experienced stress, he now experienced opportunity. Where he had once felt threatened by others' success, he now felt curiosity about their strategies. Where he had once been devastated by setbacks, he now felt excitement about the insights they would generate. As Marcus finished his morning routine and prepared to enter the day, he carried with him the psychological armor that made him essentially invulnerable to the ordinary human weaknesses that controlled most people's lives. He was immune to others' opinions because his self-worth came from his own strategic effectiveness rather than external validation. He was unafraid of failure because he had learned to extract value from any outcome. He was unintimidated by competitors because he understood that their success often created opportunities for his own advancement. Most importantly, he had achieved what Machiavelli would have recognized as the ultimate political accomplishment: he had become the master of his own psychological state. The man who could control his own mind under any circumstances could eventually control any situation. The man who had destroyed his weak self through daily discipline had indeed become indestructible by others. As the city fully awakened around him, Marcus stepped into his day not as someone hoping for favorable circumstances, but as someone who could create favorable outcomes through superior psychological preparation and strategic thinking. The weak would spend their day reacting to events. The strong would spend their day crafting reality to serve their purposes. The morning routine was complete, but its effects would reverberate through every interaction, every decision, and every challenge he would encounter. This was not self-help, this was the systematic weaponization of human psychology in service of uncompromising excellence. This was how ordinary men transformed themselves into forces of nature that shaped the world around them rather than being shaped by it. In the end, the most profound truth Marcus had discovered was that psychological strength was not a gift some people possessed and others lacked. It was a capability that could be systematically developed through the right practices applied with sufficient consistency and intensity. The man who destroyed his weak self every morning through deliberate discipline would find that no external force could destroy what he had built. In a world full of people controlled by their emotions, limited by their fears, and constrained by their comfortable mediocrity, the person who had mastered these 10 Machiavellian rules possessed advantages so profound they approached the supernatural. The weak feared what others might do to them. The strong had learned to make themselves invulnerable by becoming someone others couldn't afford to destroy, someone whose judgment was too valuable, whose strategic thinking was too superior, and whose psychological strength was too complete to be safely ignored or easily defeated. This was the true meaning of power in the modern world, not the ability to force others to do what you wanted, but the ability to become someone others needed, respected, and ultimately served, often without realizing they were doing so. The man who had built this kind of internal strength had indeed found the secret to becoming undestroyable by others, because he had first learned to systematically destroy every weak thing within himself.